When the last days of October arrive, there is a change in the air that people all over the world can feel, even if they cannot explain it. The warmth of summer has vanished, the daylight grows shorter, and the evenings fall more quickly into an unsettling kind of darkness. The trees shed their leaves, the animals prepare for hibernation, and the land itself seems to enter a long sleep. It is in this moment of seasonal shift, where one cycle of life gives way to another, that Halloween exists. It is not simply a holiday about costumes and candy, nor is it just a night for cheap scares and plastic decorations. At its heart, Halloween is a night of thresholds, a moment when the line between life and death, light and darkness, order and chaos is believed to blur. To understand what Halloween really is, you have to think of it not as a single invention, but as a layering of centuries of belief, ritual, and cultural memory. At its core is a very old idea, that there are certain points in the year when the ordinary rules of the world weaken, when the barrier between the human and the supernatural grows thin. Cultures around the world share this idea in their own ways, but for the peoples of ancient Europe, particularly the Celts, the most powerful and frightening of these thresholds fell on the last night of October. That threshold became the seed of what we call Halloween. This was not a night of meaningless indulgence. For the people who first observed it, it was sacred and dangerous at the same time. On this night, the dead were thought to wander freely among the living. Some were beloved ancestors returning home, but others were malevolent forces that did not belong in the world of the living. The rituals, costumes, fires, and feasts that developed around this moment were not for fun, but for survival. They were meant to protect the living from harm and to honor the spirits whose favor they needed for the cold months ahead. Halloween is the distant descendant of those rituals, stripped of their fear, but still carrying traces of their meaning. The threshold that defines Halloween is not just about spirits, but about time itself. In the old Celtic calendar, the year was divided into two halves, the light half and the dark half. The light half began with Beltane in May, celebrating fertility, growth, and abundance. The dark half began with Samhain in late October, marking the death of the old year and the beginning of winter. Samhain was New Year's Eve, and Judgment Day rolled into one. It was the end of the harvest, the moment when survival through the coming winter became uncertain. Families had to decide which animals to keep and which to slaughter for food, which crops to store, and which to sacrifice to the gods. It was the moment when death, both symbolic and real, entered the cycle of the community. Halloween, though transformed by centuries of change, still carries the imprint of that ancient sense of ending and beginning, of passing through a doorway from one state to another. When people light candles inside pumpkins, they are echoing the ancient fire rituals meant to guide the spirits of the dead or to keep them at bay. When children dress in costumes, they are participating in a practice that began as a way to fool wandering souls and malicious forces into thinking they were one of them. When neighborhoods hand out candy, they are unknowingly repeating the ancient tradition of giving food offerings to placate the dead. These modern customs look like play, but they are fragments of something once deeply serious, tied to the most profound human concerns: survival, mortality, and the hope of renewal. The reason Halloween has survived and spread so widely is because it speaks to something universal in human experience. Every culture has grappled with the fear of death and the mystery of what lies beyond. Every culture has created rituals to mark the end of the harvest, the shift of the seasons, and the arrival of winter. Halloween is the product of centuries of layering, where pagan rituals, Roman festivals, Christian holy days, and later folk traditions fused into a single night. The masks and candy are just the surface. Beneath them lies an ancient story about how people learned to live with death, not by ignoring it, but by facing it directly, by inviting it in, by turning a night of terror into a night of ritual, and eventually into a night of celebration. What makes Halloween so distinctive is that it has always balanced two opposite forces. On the one hand, it is about fear, danger, and the presence of death. On the other, it is about joy, abundance, and community. The bonfires that burned on the hills of ancient Europe were meant to ward off spirits, but they also brought people together in one of the few moments when entire villages gathered in the same place. The offerings of food to the dead were acts of reverence, but they also became feasts that tied communities together. Even the masks meant to confuse spirits created a rare license to break social boundaries, to be someone else for a night. This dual nature, darkness and light, terror and joy, is why Halloween has survived when so many other ancient rituals have faded. It continues to adapt, carrying that same tension into every culture it touches. As the centuries went on, the meaning of Halloween changed again and again. Each new era reshaped it, added to it, or tried to suppress it, but the core remained. To the Romans who conquered Celtic lands, it blended with their own festivals of the dead and of the harvest goddess Pomona. To the Christian Church, it was transformed into All Hallows' Eve, the night before All Saints' Day, in an attempt to overwrite the pagan past with Christian meaning. To medieval villagers, it became a night haunted by witches and demons, when the boundaries between sacred and profane were easily crossed. To immigrants in America, it carried memories of the old world while taking on new forms in a rapidly changing society. To Victorians, it became a family-centered night of games and fortune-telling, stripped of its darker fears. And in the 20th century, it became a global phenomenon of costumes, candy, and horror films. Yet no matter how much it changed, it always remained a night of thresholds, of blurred boundaries. That is what connects the modern holiday to its ancient roots. Even when celebrated with bright decorations and cartoon ghosts, it is still a night when the strange and the supernatural are close at hand, when people are drawn to what lies just beyond the ordinary. Halloween endures because it allows people to play with fear, to ritualize death, and to enter, if only for a moment, into a world where the impossible feels close enough to touch. The question then is how this night came to be, who first created it, and what it meant to them. To find that answer, we must go back, far back, to the windswept hills of Iron Age Europe, to the sacred calendar of the Celts, and to the ancient festival from which Halloween was born. It was called Samhain, and it was the most important night of the year. In the old Celtic world, there was no night more important or more feared than Samhain. This was not a festival created for entertainment, nor was it simply a harvest celebration. It was the hinge on which the entire year turned, the single most significant turning point in the Celtic calendar. To the people of Iron Age Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, the year was divided not into 4 seasons, as we commonly think today, but into 2 halves, the light half and the dark half. The light half began in spring with Beltane, a time of fertility, growth, and abundance, when the sun was high and the world was alive with green fields and new life. The dark half began with Samhain, at the very end of October, a time of death, cold, and decline, when the sun weakened, the crops were harvested, and the land prepared for its long sleep. Samhain marked the death of the old year and the birth of the new one, which is why it was not just another festival, but the most sacred night of the Celtic year. To them, this was New Year's Eve, but not in the way modern people imagine it. The night was not filled with fireworks and celebration, but with solemn rituals, fear, and reverence. It was a time when the boundaries between the living and the dead, between the natural and the supernatural, grew thin. Samhain was not only the end of summer, it was the moment when the human world and the spirit world collided. To survive in a land where winters were harsh and uncertain, where crops might fail and livestock might die, people turned to ritual to ensure their survival. At Samhain, bonfires blazed on the hills, not only as beacons of warmth, but as symbols of protection. These were not ordinary fires. They were sacred flames, lit by the Druids, the priestly class who held the knowledge of ritual and sacrifice. Entire communities would extinguish the hearth fires in their homes and wait for the great bonfire to be lit. From that single sacred flame, each household would relight their own hearths, carrying the protection of the ritual fire into the long winter months. Livestock, the backbone of Celtic survival, were driven between two great fires in a ritual of purification, a symbolic act to ward off disease and death. In some traditions, sacrifices were made. Animals, and possibly in earlier times, even humans, offered to appease the gods and the spirits of the dead. To modern ears, this may sound grim, but for the Celts, these acts were necessary exchanges to ensure life continued. Death and life were seen not as opposites, but as part of the same eternal cycle, and Samhain was the night when that cycle was most visible. The Celtic belief in the otherworld is central to understanding Samhain. Unlike the Christian idea of a distant heaven and hell, the Celts imagined a world that existed alongside their own, separated only by a thin veil. At Samhain, that veil was believed to dissolve. The spirits of the dead could walk among the living, and the living might cross into the other world. This was both a blessing and a danger. On the one hand, families welcomed their ancestors home, setting places at the table, leaving food offerings, and lighting candles to guide them. On the other, it was believed that not all spirits were kind. Some were restless, vengeful, or simply dangerous. To protect themselves, people disguised their identities, donning animal skins, masks, and costumes to confuse the wandering spirits. This is one of the earliest origins of Halloween disguises, not for fun, but for survival. Samhain was also a night of divination, when the veil between worlds made it easier to glimpse the future. In a society where survival depended on knowing whether the next season's crops would thrive or whether marriages would bring prosperity, fortune-telling was not a game but a serious ritual. Seeds were thrown into flames to watch how they burned. Apples were used in rituals to divine love and fate, and the behavior of animals was studied for omens. These practices may sound simple, but to the Celts, they were vital glimpses into the uncertain year ahead. It is important to understand that Samhain was not a single evening of festivities, but a liminal period, a time out of time. For several days, normal rules did not apply. Laws and customs could be suspended, hierarchies temporarily broken, and chaos allowed. This was not mere mischief. It was a ritualized inversion of order, a recognition that the world needed balance between stability and chaos. On Samhain, kings might step down temporarily, warriors might play the role of fools, and communities engaged in acts that would normally be forbidden. It was a controlled chaos, a ritual acknowledgement that death, disorder, and darkness were essential parts of existence. The gods and spirits most closely associated with Samhain reflect its nature as a time of endings and beginnings. The Morrigan, the great goddess of war, fate, and death, was especially linked to this season. Often appearing as a crow or raven, she was both a harbinger of doom and a protector of the land. Her presence at Samhain symbolized the power of death as a necessary force in the cycle of life. The god Dagda, often described as a father figure among the deities, also played a role at Samhain. Myths tell of his union with the Morrigan on this night, a sacred act ensuring the fertility of the land even in the face of approaching winter. These myths were not simply stories. They were part of the ritual drama that reinforced the meaning of the season. Stories from Irish mythology often frame Samhain as the time when great battles were fought, when heroes encountered spirits, and when doors to the otherworld opened. The tale of Nera, for instance, tells of a warrior who ventured into the spirit world on Samhain night and found himself trapped for what seemed like a day, but was in fact an entire year. In this story, time itself bends and breaks on Samhain, emphasizing the belief that it was not just the boundary between life and death that thinned, but the very structure of reality. Samhain was so deeply ingrained in Celtic life that it persisted even after centuries of conquest and cultural change. When the Romans arrived in Celtic lands, they encountered these autumn rituals and sought to merge them with their own festivals. The Roman Feralia, a day in late October when the dead were honoured, and the festival of Pomona, the goddess of fruit and orchards, were blended with Celtic Samhain. The result was not the destruction of the old traditions, but their transformation, a process that would repeat again and again throughout history as new religions and cultures attempted to reshape the festival. The seriousness with which Samhain was regarded can hardly be overstated. To the Celts, this was not simply a holiday, but a cosmic necessity. The bonfires, the sacrifices, the masks, and the rituals were not optional. They were vital acts that ensured the survival of the community. Without them, the balance of life and death could be disrupted, and disaster might follow. In their eyes, to neglect Samhain was to invite ruin, and yet, for all its fear and solemnity, Samhain was also a communal gathering, a moment when scattered families came together, when stories were told, and when the oral traditions that carried their myths and legends were passed down. Around those great fires, children learned the tales of gods and heroes, of the otherworld and its mysteries. It was a time of fear, but also of unity, when the entire community faced the uncertainty of winter together. When we look at the modern celebration of Halloween, with its costumes, jack-o'-lanterns, and candy, it is easy to dismiss it as something frivolous. But at its roots in Samhain, we can still see the bones of something ancient and profound. A ritual that was about survival, about honouring the dead, about facing the inevitability of death, not with denial, but with ritual, reverence, and even defiance. This festival of thresholds, where life and death mingled, where the old year ended and the new one began, would never truly disappear. It would be reshaped, renamed, and reinterpreted, but it would endure. And the next step in its transformation came with the arrival of the Roman Empire, when Samhain was forced to meet the traditions of a very different culture. For the people who first marked the night that would become Halloween, the most important truth about it was that the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead was no longer fixed. It was porous, unstable, and fragile. This was not a vague idea of ghosts wandering the earth for fun, but a deeply held conviction that the otherworld lay right beside their own, close enough to reach out and touch. On most days of the year, The living were protected from that proximity by an invisible barrier, but on the night of Samhain, that barrier dissolved. To step outside one's home on that night was to walk through a world where ancestors, spirits, and strange forces moved freely. The Celts believed that the souls of the departed continued to exist in the otherworld, a place not of final judgment, but of ongoing life beyond the senses. This otherworld was not thought of as distant or unreachable, but as overlapping with the natural landscape. Lakes, rivers, and caves were considered entrances, as were burial mounds and certain sacred hills. On Samhain, those entrances opened, and the dead were free to walk back into the world of the living. Families expected them, prepared for them, and honored them. A place at the table might be left empty, a chair reserved for the unseen guest. Food and drink were set out, not as symbolic gestures, but as genuine offerings meant to nourish returning ancestors during their brief visit. But not every spirit was welcomed. Some were hostile, restless, or dangerous. The same open door that allowed loved ones to return also gave entry to forces that were feared. To walk at night was risky. The forest and the fields might be filled with wandering souls, shape-shifting creatures, or even gods in disguise. To avoid harm, people disguised themselves, wearing masks or animal skins to confuse malevolent spirits. If they could not be recognized as human, they might be spared. These disguises were not costumes in the modern sense, but protective cloaks, a ritual armor that blurred the line between man and spirit. This belief in a night of mingling worlds was not unique to the Celts. Across cultures, there are countless traditions that describe moments when the dead return. In ancient Rome, the festival of Feralia in February honored the spirits of ancestors with offerings. In Mexico, Dia de los Muertos, though later shaped by Christian influence, still carries the same idea of a night when the dead return to be fed, honored, and remembered. In China, the Ghost Festival in the 7th month of the lunar calendar marks a similar time when the gates of the afterlife open. The persistence of these beliefs across cultures shows how fundamental the idea is that humans long to reconnect with those they have lost, and that there must be a time in the year when this reconnection is possible. For the Celts, that time was Samhain. The thinness of the veil was not limited to the dead. It also applied to the supernatural beings that populated the Celtic imagination. Fairies, or the Aossi, were thought to roam freely on this night. Unlike the small winged creatures of modern fantasy, these were powerful, often dangerous beings who lived in mounds, hills, and ancient ruins. On Samhain, their courts were believed to move from one dwelling place to another, and anyone caught in their path might be taken. To see the fairies on this night was to risk being drawn into their world, where time flowed differently and return was uncertain. Stories tell of men and women who vanished at Samhain, lured by music and light into the hills, only to return years later to find that centuries had passed. Because of this, offerings were not only left for ancestors, but also for these unpredictable beings. Bowls of milk, portions of bread, and small gifts were placed at doorsteps or on windowsills to appease them. Failure to do so could bring misfortune on the household. The veil between worlds was thin, but it was not only the realm of the dead that touched the living, it was every realm that lay just beyond sight. The fear and reverence of Samhain were intensified by the sense that time itself lost its structure. This was a night outside the normal calendar, a night when the rules of order broke down. The living might dream true dreams, seeing glimpses of their future. The dead might give warnings or blessings. The spirits of nature might act in ways they never did at other times. Even the gods were closer, their presence more immediate. Samhain was a liminal moment, a threshold, when categories blurred and opposites mixed. Life and death, human and spirit, order and chaos. One of the most enduring images of this night is the great fire burning on the hills. Its light was not just protection against the darkness, but a beacon for the wandering souls of the dead. Just as candles in windows today are lit in memory of the departed, those bonfires were both a warning to malevolent forces and a welcome to ancestors. The fire stood at the center of the community, binding the living together while also bridging the gap to the dead. The role of ancestors at Samhain reveals the deep importance of kinship in Celtic culture. The dead were not gone. They were part of the community, guardians of the living whose blessing was needed for survival. To dishonor them was to invite disaster, but to honor them was to secure prosperity. This is why food, drink, and ritual sacrifices were so central. They were not symbolic tokens, but genuine transactions in a world where the boundary between natural and supernatural was constantly shifting. Over time, as Christianity spread across Europe, the idea of the thin veil was reshaped, but not erased. The Church may have redefined Samhain as All Hallows' Eve, but the belief that the dead were near persisted. In medieval Europe, people continued to light candles in cemeteries, to ring bells for the souls in purgatory, and to offer prayers for the departed. The dead were still present, still walking near, even if their role had been reframed by Christian doctrine. The persistence of the idea shows that beneath every new layer of belief, the old conviction remained, that this was the night when the living and the dead were closest. In modern Halloween, traces of this world between worlds remain. The ghosts, skeletons, and spirits that fill decorations are playful echoes of the older belief that the dead truly walked on this night. The tradition of trick-or-treating, where children go door to door in disguise to receive food, is a faint memory of the offerings once left for wandering spirits and ancestors. Even the thrill people feel in haunted houses, or while telling ghost stories, comes from that ancient idea that on this night, the veil is thin, and the boundary between life and death is not as secure as it seems. What made Samhain, and later Halloween, so powerful is not simply that it celebrated death, but that it transformed fear of death into ritual. It gave people a way to face the unknown, to honor it, and to survive it. To live in a world where winters were brutal, where life expectancy was short, and where death was always close, rituals like these were not optional. They were necessary. By creating a night when the dead returned, the Celts gave structure to the chaos of mortality. They did not deny death, they invited it in, gave it food, gave it a place at the table, and then sent it back to the otherworld with respect. The thin veil at Samhain reminds us of something that still resonates today. Death is not a distant abstraction. It is always near, always just beyond the edge of what we can see. The rituals of Samhain gave people a way to live with that knowledge, to recognize it without being consumed by it. The bonfires, the masks, the offerings, and the stories all serve the same purpose: to manage the terror of the unknown by turning it into a communal, sacred act. As the Celts watched the bonfires burn and the night deepen, they knew they were standing on the border of two worlds. To them, it was the most dangerous and the most sacred time of the year. And as these rituals spread and transformed, that sense of walking on a threshold would never disappear. It would survive Roman conquest, Christian transformation, and centuries of cultural change, always carrying with it the memory of a night when the dead returned and the world itself was not what it seemed. And as the Celts looked into the flames, they did more than honor their dead. They were also looking for protection, for blessing, and for the strength to survive the coming winter. Which is why fire itself became the most important element of the night, both in ritual and in meaning. From this, we move naturally into the great fire festivals that define Samhain, where entire communities gathered around towering flames to ensure not only warmth, but survival. On the night when the veil thinned and the dead walked, the most striking and unforgettable sight across the Celtic world was the fire on the hills. Great bonfires blazed against the darkening sky, visible for miles, cutting through the autumn chill with both heat and light. These were not ordinary flames. They were sacred, carefully prepared and ritually lit by druids who carried the responsibility of guiding their people through the dangerous threshold of Samhain. Fire was the centerpiece of the night because it was more than a source of warmth. It was a boundary, a protection, and a symbol of the life force itself. In a world where the cold months could mean starvation and death, the fire was both literal survival and spiritual security. Entire communities would extinguish the hearth fires in their homes before the ritual began. Darkness would fall not only over the land, but inside each household. The extinguished hearth was a symbol of the old year's end, the death of what had come before. When the sacred bonfire was finally lit on the hill, its flames represented renewal, a rebirth that marked the beginning of the new year. From that central fire, torches were carried to relight every hearth in the village. Families walked through the dark carrying flame, bringing back not just light but protection, a share of the sacred fire that bound the community together. The hearth flame, renewed from the great communal blaze, was believed to keep evil spirits away during the winter and to ensure prosperity for the months to come. The fires were not only symbolic, they were used for acts of purification and protection. Herds of cattle, sheep, and horses were driven between two towering bonfires. To us, this might look like an agricultural spectacle, but to the Celts, it was a sacred rite. Passing the animals through fire and smoke was believed to protect them from disease and ensure their fertility. These herds were the backbone of survival. Without them, people could not endure the long months of scarcity. To purify them at Samhain was to invest them with the blessing of the gods at the exact moment when the year turned and the threat of death was greatest. Sacrifice was also central to the fire rituals. Animals were offered to the flames, given to the gods and to the spirits of the dead. In earlier times, there may even have been human sacrifices, though evidence is debated. The idea of offering life to the fire was not viewed as cruelty, but as necessity. It was an exchange, a way to balance the scales between life and death. To ensure survival, something had to be given up, consumed by the flames, transformed into smoke, and carried into the otherworld. The fire was the messenger, the bridge that carried those offerings from the human world to the divine. The bonfire was also a place of gathering. Families and neighbors who might be separated for much of the year came together in one place. Around the flames, stories were told, songs were sung, and myths were performed. These were not casual entertainments. They were oral traditions that passed down history, cosmology, and identity. The stories of gods, heroes, and spirits tied people to their ancestors and to the land itself. To gather around fire was to be both protected from the chaos of the night and to participate in the collective memory of the people. Archaeological evidence shows that Samhain bonfires were enormous, built to burn all night, their glow visible across entire valleys. To stand before such a fire was to feel its heat on the body, to see sparks carried into the black sky, and to know that those sparks were believed to carry prayers to the otherworld. Fire transformed everything it touched. Wood turned to ash, animals to smoke, offerings to unseen blessings. The people themselves, gathered in its light, were transformed as well. They had crossed into the dark half of the year, and the fire gave them the courage to face it. The bonfires also served as liminal boundaries. Beyond their light was the wild darkness of the night, filled with spirits, danger, and uncertainty. Inside their glow was community, safety, and ritual order. To step out of the fire's circle was to risk contact with the unknown. To remain within was to be held in the protection of shared belief. The fire thus created a sacred space, a temporary sanctuary from the chaos that Samhain unleashed. The role of fire at Samhain reflects the deep symbolism it held in Celtic spirituality. Fire was a purifying force, a destroyer and a creator. It consumed, but it also renewed. It was a visible image of transformation, mirroring the transition of the year itself. Just as fire turned wood into smoke and ash, Samhain turned life into death, but also death into renewal. Fire was the perfect symbol for the threshold, dangerous yet necessary, destructive yet protective. The ritual power of fire was not unique to the Celts, but its central place at Samhain shows how vital it was to their worldview. In many Indo-European traditions, fire served as the mediator between worlds. In Vedic rituals, fire was the mouth of the gods, consuming offerings and carrying them upward. Among the Celts, fire played the same role, bridging human and divine, living and dead. Samhain fires were the most important of all, because this was the night when that bridge was most needed. Alongside the sacred uses of fire came an element of social release. As the flames burned high and the night grew late, order could break down in controlled ways. People might leap over the flames, an act that symbolized bravery and purification. Young men and women might pair off, finding privacy at the edge of the firelight. Games of chance, contests of strength, and acts of mischief could all unfold under the cover of the night. Fire created not only protection but license. It was the stage on which the community enacted both its fears and its desires. The connection between fire and sacrifice gave Samhain a solemn weight, but it also made it the most unifying moment of the year. Everyone was bound to the fire, dependent on it, and renewed by it. Without it, winter loomed as chaos and death. With it, there was order, hope, and a sense of protection. The fire on the hills was the community's shield, its lifeline, and its link to the divine. In later centuries, as Christianity spread, these fires were condemned as pagan, but could not be erased. In many places, they were repurposed. Instead of sacrifices to gods or spirits, prayers were offered for the souls in purgatory. Instead of rituals of purification, the fires became part of Christian festivals of All Saints and All Souls. The form remained even as the meaning was redefined, showing how deeply ingrained the bonfire was in the seasonal cycle. Even today, the legacy of the Samhain fire remains visible in the glowing pumpkins, candles, and lights that mark Halloween. The jack-o'-lantern on a doorstep is a miniature bonfire, a small flame meant to ward off spirits and guide the dead. The fireworks that sometimes accompany modern Halloween celebrations echo the blazing spectacle on the hills. The central role of light in the darkness has never disappeared, even if its meaning has shifted from sacred protection to festive decoration. The bonfires of Samhain were not just practical warmth against the cold. They were cosmic events, aligning human life with the cycles of nature and the demands of the divine. They symbolize both death and renewal, destruction and protection. To gather around them was to participate in the most important ritual of the year, to face the uncertainty of winter with the strength of fire and community. As the flames burned down and the night wore on, the people knew that the fire alone was not enough. The spirits that walked on this night required more than offerings in the flames. They required direct appeasement, food and gifts left at the door, disguises worn to confuse them, and rituals meant to protect the living. The fire might purify, but to truly survive the night, people turned to another strategy, masking themselves, hiding their identities, and meeting the spirits face to face in disguise. When the fires burned high and the veil between worlds was at its thinnest, the people who gathered at Samhain did not rely only on flames to protect them. The fire lit the hills and purified the herds, but it could not shield every individual who stepped into the night. The spirits, ancestors, and strange forces that moved freely during this time were not confined to the shadows beyond the bonfire. They walked along paths, passed through villages, and lingered at thresholds. To encounter one unprotected could mean sickness, misfortune, or being lured into the otherworld. This is why people turned to another form of defense, one that blurred the boundary between human and spirit: the mask. Disguise at Samhain was not a form of entertainment or play, it was survival. To walk unmasked on that night was to risk being recognized as human, vulnerable to restless souls or wandering beings who might seek to harm or abduct. By covering the face, cloaking the body in animal skins or strange costumes, people sought to confuse the spirits, to make them believe they were one of their own. In a world where the dead and the living shared the same space, identity itself became dangerous. The solution was to abandon it, if only for a night. Animal disguises were among the earliest and most common. Skins and skulls were worn, horns and antlers strapped to heads, fur cloaks draped over shoulders. These were not crude costumes for spectacle, but serious attempts to shift the wearer into something unrecognizable. The animal form was both a mask and a transformation, aligning the human with the forces of nature and the spirits of the otherworld. In Celtic myth, many gods and beings took animal forms, and by imitating them, people hoped to slip into anonymity. To wear the face of a stag, a wolf, or a crow was to blur the line between man and spirit, to walk safely through the dangerous night. Masks themselves carried their own power. A mask was not simply a covering, it was believed to hold magical potential. To wear one was to take on a different identity, to become something other than oneself. In the liminal time of Samhain, when order and category broke down, masks allowed for transformation. The timid might become fierce, the powerless might become powerful, and the living might pass as the dead. Behind a mask, the human was no longer bound to their usual role. They became part of the in-between world that defined the night. The disguises also served another purpose. They allowed people to interact directly with spirits and with each other in ways that normal society would not permit. When masked, one could beg for food, gifts, or offerings without shame, echoing the way offerings were left for spirits at the door. These disguised figures were not seen as ordinary beggars, but as representatives of the wandering dead. To turn them away might be to insult the spirits themselves. This ritualized begging and gift-giving became one of the roots of what we now know as trick-or-treating, where costumed figures knock on doors in expectation of food. In later centuries, as Christianity reshaped the festival, the disguises were still there. Instead of representing spirits, they became linked to demons, witches, or souls in purgatory. The practice of mumming or guising spread, where groups of costumed people would travel door to door, performing small plays or songs in exchange for food or drink. These performances were echoes of the older belief, where the mask blurred the line between human visitor and supernatural being. Even when the church tried to suppress the older meanings, the disguises remained, adapted to new contexts, but never entirely stripped of their association with the spirit world. The act of hiding behind a mask also connected to the deeper symbolic nature of Samhain. This was a night when the world itself was disguised. The year disguised itself as death, the land disguised itself in barrenness, and the natural order disguised itself in chaos. To wear a mask was to participate in the disguise of the world, to mirror the transformation of reality. It was a ritual acknowledgement that nothing on this night was what it seemed. There was also an element of license in the disguises. Hidden identities meant that normal rules could be broken. The poor could mock the rich, the young could mock the old, and mischief could be played without fear of punishment. Masks gave cover to acts of inversion, moments where society itself was turned upside down in controlled chaos. This was not random mischief, but part of the ritual function of Samhain. Just as order had to be broken so that it could be renewed, identity had to be masked so that it could be reclaimed. The memory of these disguises persisted strongly, even as the festival spread and changed. In medieval Ireland and Scotland, accounts describe people going house to house in costumes, carrying lanterns carved from turnips with grotesque faces, demanding offerings in the name of the dead. These figures were half human, half spirit, representatives of the thin veil. To refuse them was risky, for they were believed to carry the power of mischief and misfortune. The threat was implicit: give them food or suffer the consequences. It was not yet candy and fun, but a ritualized negotiation with the forces of the otherworld. In some regions, the disguises grew darker, associated not just with protection, but with intimidation. Masked groups could demand goods or food from households, and if denied, they might play pranks or cause damage. The link between disguise and mischief deepened over time, laying the groundwork for the later traditions of Halloween pranking that would flourish centuries later in America. What had begun as a spiritual defense had become both a ritual of exchange and a form of social power. The disguise at Samhain was more than a mask. It was a way of navigating a dangerous world, a method of survival when reality itself was unstable. To step into the night unmasked was to invite danger. To put on the mask was to join in the blurring of categories, to become part of the liminal world rather than its victim. The disguise was at once shield, transformation, and license. Even now, when children put on plastic masks of witches, vampires, or superheroes, they are unknowingly repeating this ancient ritual. The modern costume may be playful, but its roots are serious. It echoes the fear of being recognized by the dead, the desire to confuse wandering spirits, and the thrill of stepping outside one's identity for a night. Halloween disguises are not random invention, but cultural memory, fragments of a time when a mask was the only way to walk safely through a world alive with spirits. But masks alone were not enough. The spirits that walked on Samhain were not only fooled by disguise, they were also hungry. They needed offerings, gifts left at the doorstep or shared with disguised visitors. Just as fire purified and masks confused, food appeased. Without it, the spirits could grow restless and mischief could turn into danger. This is why the Feast of Samhain became as important as the fire and the mask, a sacred meal not just for the living, but for the dead themselves. At the heart of Samhain, alongside the fire and the mask, was food. To the Celts, food was not only sustenance, but currency, a medium of exchange between the living and the dead. The harvest was over, the fields were bare, and the community stood on the edge of winter. Every loaf of bread, every barrel of grain, every cured piece of meat represented survival. To give food away at such a moment was no small act. It was a sacred offering. On Samhain, this offering was essential, for the night was not only about protecting the living, it was about feeding the dead. The idea that the dead required food and drink was not unique to the Celts. Across the ancient world, people believed that the spirits of the departed still hungered and thirsted. In Rome, families visited graves during the festival of Feralia to leave bread, salt, and wine for their ancestors. In China, offerings of rice and incense were placed on household altars to nourish wandering spirits during the ghost festival. In Mexico, Dia de los Muertos altars are piled with pan de muerto, sugar skulls, and favorite foods of the departed. The belief that the dead return hungry is a universal one. At Samhain, this belief was at the center of the ritual. Food was left out on doorsteps, placed at the edges of fields, or left at crossroads, all places thought to be frequented by spirits. Bread, milk, fruits, and pieces of meat were set aside, not to be eaten by the living, but to appease the invisible guests. This was not charity. It was insurance. A well-fed spirit was thought to bring blessing and protection. A hungry, neglected one might bring sickness, failed crops, or worse. To forget the offering was to risk the wrath of forces that could not be seen, but were always near. Inside the home, the dead were honored with more personal gestures. A place at the table might be left empty, a plate and cup laid out as if the departed would sit among the living. Families spoke of their ancestors as if they were present, telling stories, remembering their deeds, and invoking their names. This was more than memory. It was participation in the belief that on this night, the ancestors truly were there, sitting by the fire, eating at the table, watching over their descendants. The Feast of Samhain was both communal and intimate, a bridge between generations. The food itself carried symbolic weight. Apples, for example, were strongly associated with immortality and the otherworld in Celtic myth. They were often part of Samhain offerings and games of divination. Grains and bread symbolized the harvest's bounty, transformed by human labor into sustenance. Meat represented the animals culled at this time of year, both for survival and sacrifice. Every piece of food was a reminder of the delicate balance between life and death, sustenance and scarcity. But these offerings did not always remain untouched. Masked figures who went door to door during Samhain often claimed them, acting as intermediaries of the dead. Disguised in animal skins and masks, they presented themselves not as neighbors, but as spirits in need of nourishment. To give them food was to fulfill the obligation of feeding the dead. To refuse them was dangerous, for the figures might retaliate with tricks or curses, echoing the restless anger of the unappeased spirits. This ritualized exchange between disguised visitors and households was the seed of a tradition that, centuries later, would evolve into trick-or-treating. By the Middle Ages, this practice had been reshaped under Christian influence into what was known as souling. On All Hallows Eve and All Souls Day, the poor, often children, would go door to door, offering prayers for the dead in exchange for food, particularly small round cakes known as soul cakes. The idea was that by feeding the living, one was also aiding the souls in purgatory, helping them find rest. Though the theological framework was Christian, the underlying practice was much older. The belief that food offered to strangers in liminal times was a form of feeding the dead. In Scotland and Ireland, a similar practice called guising persisted. Costumed children would go from house to house, reciting verses or performing small tricks in exchange for food, fruit, or coins. Unlike souling, guising leaned more heavily on the element of disguise and performance, recalling the older Celtic idea of masked figures representing spirits. These traditions reveal how the offerings of Samhain gradually shifted from gifts left for unseen ancestors to exchanges with visible, costumed visitors. But the principle remained the same. Food was the bridge between worlds. The communal feast of Samhain was equally important. After the rituals, the offerings, and the masking, families and neighbours came together to share the harvest. This was not only celebration, but necessity. By pooling resources, the community ensured that everyone entered the winter with some measure of security. The feast was also a reaffirmation of survival. Against the backdrop of death and darkness, people ate and drank together, proclaiming life even as they honoured the dead. Divination and games often accompanied these feasts. Apples were used in rituals of love and fate, their bobbing in water symbolising luck and fertility. Nuts were thrown into fires to predict the future of relationships. Cakes were baked with hidden charms inside, each symbol foretelling a different destiny for the one who found it. Food, then, was not only sustenance and offering, but a tool of prophecy, a way to glimpse what the uncertain future might hold. As centuries passed, the sacred weight of these rituals slowly shifted. What was once a serious offering to appease ancestors became more of a game, a chance for children to dress in costume and collect treats. What was once a communal feast of survival became a family-centered holiday meal. Yet the echoes of the old belief remain. To this day, children go door to door expecting gifts of food, and households prepare for their arrival with bowls of sweets. The dead are no longer explicitly invoked, but the exchange still carries the memory of a time when food was the currency between the living and the dead. Even the trick in Trick or Treat carries an ancient resonance. It is the shadow of the threat once implied by masked visitors, who stood at the door as representatives of restless spirits. Feed us, or we will cause harm. Today, the trick is mostly symbolic, a joke, but its roots lie in that old understanding that neglecting the offerings could invite misfortune. The playful pranks of Halloween night are the faint memory of dangerous spirits appeased by food. Food is always central to ritual because it is the most basic form of survival. At Samhain, when the harvest was over and the future uncertain, sharing food with the dead and with each other was a way of managing fear. It turned mortality into exchange, absence into presence, and scarcity into community. It was not only about appeasing spirits, but about ensuring that the living themselves felt secure, connected, and blessed. The offerings, the disguises, and the bonfires together formed a complete ritual system. The fire purified, the masks protected, and the food appeased. With these acts, the Celts prepared themselves to enter the dark half of the year, but Samhain would not remain unchanged. When the Romans came, they brought their own festivals of the dead and the harvest, merging them with the Celtic rites. The result was not the disappearance of Samhain, but its transformation as Roman gods and traditions mingled with Celtic beliefs to create a new, layered festival. When the Romans extended their empire into the Celtic lands, they did what they had done everywhere they went. They imposed their own structures of governance, law, and religion, but they also absorbed local customs, weaving them into the fabric of Roman life, rather than trying to erase them outright. In Britain, Gaul, and other Celtic regions, this process of cultural blending reshaped Samhain. The Romans brought with them their own festivals that honoured the dead and celebrated the harvest, and in time, these fused with the older Celtic traditions. The result was not the disappearance of Samhain, but its transformation, another step in the long evolution that would eventually give rise to Halloween. Two Roman festivals in particular shaped this process, Feralia and Pomona. Feralia was held in late February, but its themes echoed those of Samhain. It was part of the larger Parentalia festival, a 9-day observance devoted to honouring the dead. Families visited the graves of their ancestors, leaving food offerings of bread, salt, wine, and garlands. It was a time when the barrier between the living and the dead was thought to thin, when ancestors returned to be nourished by the care of their descendants. The offerings were not just tokens. They were essential acts of piety. To neglect them was to risk angering the dead, who might return to torment the living. The Romans, like the Celts, believed that the dead still hungered, that their presence lingered, and that ritual feeding was a sacred duty. Feralia also carried an undercurrent of unease. Ovid, the Roman poet, described it as a time when the dead roamed freely, when the streets of Rome were thick with spirits, if not properly appeased. He warned that failing to honour the dead could unleash chaos, a belief that resonated strongly with the Celtic understanding of Samhain. The Celts and the Romans may have differed in their calendars and rituals, but they shared the conviction that there were moments in the year when the dead demanded attention, and that ignoring them was dangerous. When Roman settlers and soldiers encountered Samhain in Celtic lands, they would have recognized the similarities immediately, even if the timing was different. The other Roman influence was the festival of Pomona, held in late October to honor the goddess of fruits, orchards, and abundance. Pomona was not associated with death, but with the harvest, with the bounty of apples, nuts, and other fruits gathered in before the onset of winter. Her symbols were the apple and the orchard, and her festival was filled with games, offerings, and rituals celebrating fertility and abundance. Unlike the somber tone of Feralia, Pomona's festival was one of joy and plenty. When these Roman traditions mingled with Samhain, the fusion was powerful. The solemnity of honouring the dead and the joy of celebrating the harvest blended into one night. The offerings of food to spirits took on Roman flavours, and the use of apples, so central to Pomona, began to appear in Celtic rites of divination. This is one of the likely origins of apple-based games associated with Halloween, such as bobbing for apples. What might look like a light-hearted pastime today was once a ritual of fortune-telling, a way to glimpse who might marry, who might prosper, or who might suffer in the year ahead. Apples floated in water symbolized abundance and life, and to grasp one was to grasp a piece of fortune. The Romans were pragmatic about religion. They did not demand that conquered peoples abandon their gods. Instead, they identified local deities with Roman ones and allowed their worship to continue under new names. The Celtic gods of the harvest, fertility, and death were mapped onto Roman figures, and their festivals absorbed Roman practices. Over time, Samhain was no longer purely Celtic, but an amalgam of Celtic and Roman elements, a hybrid ritual that carried forward the themes of death, fertility, and the turning of the year. This blending of traditions was not always peaceful or seamless. For the Celts, whose spirituality was deeply tied to land, season, and ancestry, the imposition of Roman ritual could not replace the old meanings. Yet Roman festivals did not erase Samhain, they added to it. The Celts continued to honor their ancestors, to light fires, and to wear disguises. But now the rituals included apples, Roman-style offerings, and games that reflected Pomona's fertility symbolism. The dead still walked, but they walked alongside the imagery of Roman orchards. The absorption of Samhain into Roman practice shows the resilience of the festival. Rather than vanishing under conquest, it adapted, absorbing new layers of meaning. This adaptability is one of the reasons Halloween survived at all. If Samhain had been rigid, tied only to specific rituals, it might have been crushed by Roman power. Instead, its core themes, death, renewal, harvest, and the thin veil, were broad enough to blend with Roman traditions and survive. Each edition layered more complexity onto the night, preparing it for the even greater transformation that would come with Christianity. Pomona's apple is particularly symbolic in this evolution. Apples were already significant in Celtic myth, often associated with the otherworld. In Irish tales, magical islands filled with apples symbolized immortality and eternal youth. The fusion of Pomona's apple with Celtic beliefs strengthened this association, embedding the fruit into the rituals of Samhain. It is not a coincidence that apples remain central to Halloween games centuries later. They are a lingering trace of both Roman and Celtic symbolism, the fruit of abundance tied to the mysteries of the otherworld. The Roman conquest did not destroy Samhain. Instead, it reshaped it, binding it to a larger Mediterranean world of ritual and myth. The bonfires still burned, the masks were still worn, and the offerings still fed the dead. But now apples floated in water, nuts cracked in games of divination, and Roman concepts of honoring the departed joined Celtic rites of survival. The old and the new intertwined, setting the stage for the next transformation. Because when Christianity arrived, it brought with it a different kind of conquest, not military, but spiritual. The Church, unlike the Romans, did not seek to merge Celtic gods with its own pantheon. It sought to erase them. Yet even Christianity, with its insistence on a single truth, could not obliterate Samhain. Instead, it reshaped it again, layering saints, angels, and prayers for the dead onto the ancient night. Samhain would become All Hallows' Eve, and the Festival of Thresholds would take on a new guise. When Christianity spread across Europe, it did not arrive as a gentle blending of traditions, as the Romans had done with their gods and festivals. The Church was not content to let pagan rituals coexist alongside Christian belief. Its goal was to replace them, to draw people away from the old gods and spirits, and bind them instead to the saints, angels, and one almighty God. Yet Samhain was so deeply embedded in the cycle of life, death, and survival that it could not simply be erased. It carried too much weight, too much memory, and too much necessity. The Church recognized this and responded with a familiar strategy. It rebranded. The Festival of the Dead was not abolished, it was transformed. By the early Middle Ages, the Church had already established feast days to honor saints and martyrs. All Saints' Day, also known as All Hallows, became a central part of this effort. Its origins are debated, but by the 9th century, it was officially placed on November 1st, aligning almost perfectly with Samhain. The choice was deliberate. By situating the Feast of Saints immediately after the Night of the Dead, the Church could redirect the energy of the old festival into Christian forms. Instead of honouring ancestors and wandering spirits, people were to honour saints in heaven. Instead of fearing the restless dead, they were encouraged to pray for the souls in purgatory. The night before All Saints' Day became known as All Hallows' Eve. In time, the name would contract into Halloween, but in its earliest Christian form, the night was not about costumes or candy. It was about vigil, prayer, and remembrance. Bells were rung to ward off evil spirits, candles lit in cemeteries to guide souls, and prayers offered for the departed. The fire and the mask remained, but they were given new explanations. The bonfires were said to honour saints rather than pagan gods. The disguises were reframed as defences against demons rather than ancestral spirits. The meaning was changed, but the practices endured. All Souls' Day was added soon after, on November 2nd. Where All Saints honoured the holy dead who had already reached heaven, All Souls was dedicated to the ordinary dead, the countless souls believed to be suffering in purgatory. The living were called to pray for them, to give alms, and to offer food in their memory. This layering of holy days created a 3-day season of remembrance: All Hallows' Eve, All Saints' Day, and All Souls' Day. Together, they redirected the old Samhain into a Christian framework, but the resemblance to the older festival was unmistakable. It was still about the dead, still about the threshold, still about the living trying to negotiate with the unseen. The practice of offering food shifted but did not vanish. Instead of feeding wandering spirits, people baked special breads and cakes as offerings for the souls in purgatory. Known as soul cakes, these small, round breads were given to the poor in exchange for prayers for the dead. The belief was that each cake eaten, each prayer said, might shorten the time a soul spent in suffering before reaching heaven. Children and beggars went from house to house, singing or praying for the dead and receiving cakes in return. This practice of souling was a direct ancestor of trick-or-treating, carrying forward the exchange of food for spiritual protection. The disguises too persisted. Instead of masking themselves to confuse spirits, people now dressed as saints, angels, or sometimes as demons, playing out the drama of salvation and damnation. In some regions, processions were held in which costume figures represented the souls of the dead, moving through villages to remind the living of their duty to pray. The old masks of Samhain, once meant to protect, had become tools of religious theatre. Yet beneath the Christian surface, the memory of the older belief remained, that the boundary between worlds was fragile, and that on this night, the dead were close. Despite the Church's efforts, the old fears clung to the festival. Medieval sermons warned of demons roaming on All Hallows' Eve, seeking souls to drag to hell. Folk traditions spoke of witches, fairies, and restless spirits who still walked. The Church had renamed the festival, but it could not erase the unease people felt. The thin veil was too deeply believed, too much a part of lived experience to disappear. Christian rituals of bells, candles, and prayers sat side by side with older customs of disguises, offerings, and bonfires. The Christian transformation of Samhain into Halloween was not complete control, but compromise. The Church imposed its framework, but the people carried their own traditions into it. The result was a hybrid festival, half sacred vigil, half folk ritual, where saints and spirits, prayers and pranks shared the same night. It was in this blending that Halloween as we know it truly began. For the first time, the festival was both deeply religious and stubbornly popular, a night shaped as much by official doctrine as by village custom. The Church's efforts to sanctify the night reveal an important truth about Halloween's survival. It endured because it was flexible. It could be reframed, renamed, and reshaped. But its essence, honoring the dead, negotiating with spirits, marking the threshold of the year, remained constant. Christianity did not erase Halloween. It gave it new clothes, layering saints and prayers over bones and masks, but leaving the skeleton of the old festival intact. Yet the Christian version of Halloween also amplified its darker side. In trying to define the night as one of prayer and vigilance, the Church sharpened the association with evil. What had once been spirits and fairies became demons and witches. What had once been offerings to ancestors became warnings about heresy and sin. Halloween became not only a night of remembrance, but a night of fear, when the forces of hell were thought to be most active. And as the Middle Ages deepened, this fear grew. Stories spread of witches flying through the night, of the devil himself walking the earth, of spectral armies and ghostly processions sweeping across the sky. Halloween was no longer only a festival of ancestors. It was becoming a night of demons. The transformation had only begun. As the medieval world settled deeper into Christianity, the night once devoted to ancestors and saints began to carry a far darker reputation. By the later Middle Ages, All Hallows' Eve was no longer seen simply as a time for prayer and remembrance. It was a night when evil forces were thought to roam more freely than at any other time of year. The thin veil between worlds, which had once been the bridge for ancestors to return, was now described by the Church as an opening for demons, witches, and the devil himself. What had begun as a sacred threshold between the living and the dead was reframed as a dangerous portal to hell. This shift did not happen all at once. It grew slowly, out of the Church's efforts to redefine the old spirits of Samhain. Fairies, once feared but respected, were rebranded as demons. Ancestral spirits were dismissed as illusions sent by the devil. Even the rituals meant to honor or appease these beings were condemned as heresy. Lighting a fire to ward off spirits was tolerated if it was said to honor saints, but if it carried the memory of older gods, it was denounced. Wearing masks could be reframed as religious theater, but if it was tied to older beliefs, it was dangerous superstition. The same practices continued, but their meaning shifted, often carrying a shadow of suspicion. At the same time, Europe was gripped by an increasing fear of witchcraft, the belief that witches made pacts with the devil, that they flew through the night to gather at secret Sabbaths, and that they used spells to harm crops, livestock, and people spread across villages and towns. All Hallows' Eve, already associated with spirits and the supernatural, became one of the night's most strongly linked to witches. It was said to be a time when they were most active, riding through the skies, casting curses, and communing with demonic forces. The fires that once purified herds were now thought to protect against witches, and the masks that once confused spirits were reimagined as disguises against demonic recognition. Stories circulated of the Wild Hunt, a spectral procession of ghostly riders led by a god, spirit, or even the devil himself. On Halloween night, it was said, the hunt swept across the skies, gathering souls of the unlucky and dragging them away. To hear the sound of horses' hooves or hounds in the distance was a dire omen. These stories reinforced the sense that Halloween was not simply about the return of the dead, but about the intrusion of chaos and evil into the human world. The old liminality of the festival had not disappeared. It had darkened. The church's teachings encouraged people to view misfortune through the lens of demonic interference. If a cow sickened, if a crop failed, if a child fell ill, it might be blamed on witchcraft or on spirits active during All Hallows' Eve. Rituals that once offered protection against wandering souls now carried the additional weight of warding off demons. Bells were rung to drive away devils, holy water sprinkled at thresholds, and prayers recited at the stroke of midnight. The old rituals of fire, mask, and food had been reinterpreted in Christian terms, but their purpose remained strikingly similar: protection against unseen forces in the dangerous night. The fear of witchcraft reached its height between the 15th and 17th centuries, when trials and executions swept across Europe. Halloween became entangled with this fear. Manuals on witch hunting described the kinds of spells and curses witches might perform on All Hallows' Eve. People were warned not to wander after dark, not to leave food out except as offerings for the souls in purgatory, and not to engage in superstitions that might be mistaken for witchcraft. The church tried to draw a clear line. Prayers and masses were acceptable, but divination games and folk rituals were not. Yet in practice, people continued both. They went to church by day and played with apples and nuts by night, blending Christian devotion with older customs in ways that defied strict categories. The devil himself became closely linked to Halloween during this period. Folklore described him walking the earth on this night, seeking souls to claim. Crossroads, already associated with spirits, became places of special danger, where one might encounter him face to face. Bargains with the devil were said to be struck on Halloween, a theme that would later echo in folk tales about figures like Stingy Jack, whose deal with the devil gave rise to the jack-o'-lantern tradition. In the medieval imagination, Halloween was the night when the devil's power was strongest, when the boundaries between his realm and the human world were dangerously thin. This darkening of the festival had profound effects on how it was celebrated. For some, it became a night of fear and prayer, a time to stay indoors, light candles, and protect the household from evil. For others, it remained a night of disguise, mischief, and offerings, but now those acts carried a sharper edge. To dress as a spirit or devil was no longer just a protective mask. It was a risky flirtation with forbidden powers. To play pranks was no longer only ritual chaos, it could be interpreted as witchcraft. Halloween had become a contested space, caught between folk tradition and religious fear. Yet it is precisely this tension that gave Halloween its enduring character. It was never purely holy and never purely profane. It was both, a night when the sacred and the demonic coexisted, when the same act could be seen as prayer or heresy, depending on who judged it. This ambiguity made it endlessly adaptable, capable of absorbing new fears and new meanings. Over time, the association with witches, demons, and the devil became a permanent part of its imagery, shaping how people saw the night long after the witch hunts ended. Even today, the legacy of this transformation is visible. The witches' hats, devil's horns, and ghostly figures that fill Halloween decorations are not just playful inventions of modern commerce. They are the echoes of a medieval world where All Hallows' Eve was feared as the devil's night, when witches flew and demons prowled. The funhouse version we see now is a shadow of the terror it once inspired. But Halloween was never only about fear. Alongside the demons and witches, people still told stories, played games, and used the night for rituals of fortune and prophecy. The darkness of the night was balanced by the light of community and the thrill of glimpsing the future. To understand Halloween fully, we must also look at these traditions of haunted harvests, ghostly omens, and folk magic that thrived even in the shadow of fear. As the Middle Ages wore on, Halloween, still officially the Eve of All Hallows, remained a night saturated not only with fear of demons and witches, but also with a fascination for stories, omens, and the uncanny. People lived close to the land, their survival tied to the rhythms of sowing and reaping, their imaginations sharpened by long nights with little light but fire and candle. In that setting, Halloween became a haunted harvest, a time when tales of the supernatural flourished, when folk sought meaning in the smallest of signs, and when magic seemed less like superstition and more like a necessary way to make sense of a world filled with uncertainty. The harvest itself lent a particular atmosphere to the night. The barns were full, the animals culled, and the fields stripped bare. With the land emptied of its bounty, a kind of starkness settled across the countryside. The abundance of summer was gone, replaced by silence, frost, and darkness. It was easy to believe that unseen forces moved across the fields now that the crops were gone, that the land belonged not to the living, but to the spirits of the dead and the supernatural. Ghost stories became part of the season's fabric, told around hearths or bonfires to explain strange noises in the night, sudden winds, or the chill of an unseen presence. These ghost stories were not entertainment alone. They were cautionary tales, warnings about the power of the dead and the thinness of the veil. Some told of wandering souls who returned because they had been wronged in life, demanding justice or vengeance before they could rest. Others spoke of spectral armies marching across the skies, echoes of battles long past. Still others warned of headless riders or phantom dogs prowling crossroads. Each story reinforced the idea that Halloween was not simply another night. It was a rupture in the normal order, when the past and present, the living and the dead, overlapped. Folk omens also abounded. The natural world was read like a text, every sound and movement potentially carrying a message. A raven croaking at midnight was thought to foretell death. A sudden knock at the door with no one outside could signal a spirit's visit. A candle that refused to stay lit might mean that an unseen guest had entered the room. Even the direction of the wind on Halloween night was read as an omen, believed to predict whether the coming winter would be mild or harsh. The festival, tied so closely to survival, encouraged this search for signs. People wanted to know what the year ahead would bring, and Halloween gave them a framework to seek answers. Magic at Halloween often centered on divination, and while the church condemned such practices as superstition or heresy, they remained widespread. Young people especially turned to folk rituals to learn about love, marriage, and fortune. Apples and nuts, abundant at harvest, became the tools of these games. An apple peel thrown over the shoulder was said to land in the shape of a future spouse's initial. 2 nuts placed on a fire were believed to reveal the fate of a couple. If they burned together, the match would be faithful. If they popped apart, the bond would break. Water and mirrors were also used for scrying, with girls gazing into them by candlelight to catch glimpses of their future husbands. These rituals, half game and half magic, made Halloween a night of possibility as well as fear. Communities also practiced protective magic. Herbs like sage, rowan, and vervain were burned or hung over doorways to ward off wandering spirits. Carved turnips with grotesque faces, lit from within by candles, were placed at thresholds to frighten away the dead or to guide lost souls. These lanterns were both protective talismans and symbols of the thin veil. The fire inside represented the sacred flame, the carved face, the disguise that confused malevolent beings. Long before pumpkins became the emblem of Halloween in America, these humble turnip lanterns lit the way in Celtic and medieval villages. Haunted harvest customs also blended seamlessly with storytelling. Farmers, labourers, and children gathered to hear tales that blurred the line between history and myth. A ruined castle might be said to be haunted by its lord, cursed for his cruelty. A lonely bridge might be the site of ghostly encounters each Halloween, when a spirit returned to replay its death. These stories served as both entertainment and moral instruction, warning listeners about greed, betrayal, or neglect of the dead. The season of death demanded stories of death, and Halloween became the night when they were shared most eagerly. The church could not fully suppress these customs. Priests condemned fortune-telling and ghost stories, but the people clung to them. For rural communities, they were not idle superstitions, but frameworks for understanding the world. When crops failed, when sickness spread, or when someone died unexpectedly, the stories and omens of Halloween gave explanations and a sense of order, even if that order was supernatural. They also gave people agency. By reading signs, by performing small acts of magic, by honouring the dead with offerings, people felt they could influence fate, even in a world that often seemed governed by forces beyond their control. Over time, these ghostly traditions became inseparable from Halloween. The night was not only about prayer for saints or fear of witches, it was also the chosen stage for tales of the uncanny. People expected to hear them on this night, just as they expected to see masked figures or light candles for the dead. The haunted harvest was part of the season's identity, a cultural pattern that survived into the Victorian era, when ghost stories by the fireside remained a popular Halloween pastime. What is striking is how these medieval beliefs about omens and folk magic still echo today. The carved lanterns survive as jack-o'-lanterns. The ghost stories survive in horror films, haunted houses, and Halloween parties. The divination games survive in watered-down forms, like bobbing for apples. Even the sense that Halloween is the best time for the uncanny to appear, for spirits to walk and the supernatural to be close, has never vanished. The haunted harvest may have been reshaped and commercialized, but its bones are ancient. And yet, for all the ghost stories and omens, Halloween was never only about fear. It was also about curiosity, about the desire to peer into the future and discover what lay ahead. The fortune-telling games and love divinations of Halloween show that the night was not just haunted by the past, it was also haunted by the future. To fully understand this, we have to turn to the ways people used Halloween as a mirror, not only to see the dead, but to glimpse their own destiny. Halloween was never only a night of ghosts, demons, and the dead. For centuries, it was also the night when people believed the veil of time itself grew thin. Just as the boundary between the living and the dead weakened, so too did the wall between present and future. The same liminal quality that allowed ancestors to walk among the living made it possible, people thought, to catch glimpses of what had not yet happened. And so, Halloween became one of the great nights of divination, when ordinary men and women, especially the young, turned to folk rituals to ask questions about love, marriage, prosperity, and fate. The connection between Halloween and fortune-telling was natural. At the end of the harvest, with the long winter ahead, uncertainty loomed. Would the crops last? Would the livestock survive? Would marriages bring alliances and children in the year ahead? These were not idle curiosities, but matters of survival. Folk divination gave people a sense of agency, a way to peek into the unknown and feel some measure of control. And because Halloween was the night of thresholds, when categories dissolved and realities overlapped, it was the perfect moment to try. Apples played the starring role in many of these rituals. Their connection to Pomona, the Roman goddess of orchards, and to the Celtic otherworld made them especially powerful symbols. In some games, an apple was peeled in a single long strip, then thrown over the shoulder. The shape it formed on the ground was said to reveal the first initial of a future spouse. In others, apples were placed in a basin of water, and young people tried to bite them without using their hands. Whoever succeeded first was believed to be the next to marry. What looks today like a simple party game, bobbing for apples, was once a serious piece of love divination. The apple in these rituals was more than fruit. It was a vessel of destiny. Nuts too played a role. In Ireland and Scotland, nuts were placed in the hearthfire in pairs, each nut representing two people. If the nuts burned quietly together, the couple's love would last. If they popped apart, separation was foretold. This simple act of watching nuts crack and spark carried deep meaning in a society where marriage was not only about affection, but also about alliances and survival. A match that endured meant prosperity for two families. A match that failed could mean hardship. Mirrors and water were also tools of prophecy. A young woman might stand before a mirror at midnight on Halloween, holding a candle and eating an apple, waiting for the face of her future husband to appear beside her reflection. Others gazed into bowls of water or polished surfaces, hoping for visions of what lay ahead. These rituals carried a certain danger, for mirrors were thought to be gateways to other realms. To peer too deeply might not only reveal the future, but also invite spirits to step through. Still, the desire to know was strong enough that countless people tried, balancing fear with hope. Even household tasks could be turned into omens on Halloween. A girl who brushed her hair by candlelight while saying a charm might see her future husband behind her. A piece of cabbage pulled from the garden at midnight could reveal wealth or poverty, depending on its shape. Dreams on Halloween night were said to be especially prophetic, influenced by the spirits that roamed. People placed sprigs of herbs under their pillows or performed small rituals before sleep to ensure that dreams would show their fate. For young people, especially those on the edge of marriage, these games carried a thrill that was half play and half belief. They were often performed in groups, with laughter and teasing, but beneath the fun was a real sense of possibility. The outcomes were remembered, repeated, and taken seriously, especially in rural communities where tradition held strong. Halloween became a courtship night as much as a ghost night, a moment when the mysteries of love and death mingled together. The church disapproved of such practices, branding them superstitions or even works of the devil. To seek knowledge of the future, it warned, was to trespass on forbidden ground. And yet the rituals persisted. They were too deeply tied to the season, too attractive to the curiosity of youth, and too hopeful in the face of uncertainty. Christian households might pray for souls by day and play divination games by night, living comfortably in contradiction. Over time, the fortune-telling traditions became as expected as the ghost stories and bonfires. By the Victorian era, they were written about in newspapers and etiquette books as part of Halloween parties. In the United States, immigrants carried these customs across the Atlantic, where apple bobbing and nut burning games took on new life in parlors and barns. What had once been serious attempts to see the future became parlor entertainment, but the structure of the rituals remained the same. The thrill of looking for signs in apples, nuts, and mirrors survived even when belief in their accuracy waned. The persistence of these practices shows how central the theme of foresight was to Halloween. It was never only about honoring the dead or fearing spirits. It was also about negotiating with the future, seeking answers to questions that haunted people as much as death did. Love, marriage, prosperity, survival. These were the stakes of Halloween fortune-telling, and in their own way, the rituals were as much about managing anxiety as the bonfires or offerings. By turning uncertainty into games, people transformed fear into play, just as they did with death itself. Today, fortune-telling is no longer a central part of Halloween, but echoes remain. Apple bobbing still appears at parties, even if few remember its divinatory roots. Stories of Halloween divinations survive in folklore, reminding us that the night once promised more than candy and costumes. It promised a glimpse of what lay ahead. And though most people no longer look to mirrors or nuts for omens, the association of Halloween with prophecy lives on in popular culture, in tales of witches foretelling fates or haunted mirrors revealing truths. Halloween had now become an intricate weave, a night of saints and souls, of witches and demons, of ghost stories and omens, of disguises and offerings. Each layer added complexity, and each transformation carried it forward. But the story of Halloween did not remain bound to Europe. In time, it would cross the ocean, carried by immigrants who brought their memories and rituals with them. In a new land, far from Celtic hills and Roman orchards, Halloween would change again, reshaped by the struggles and opportunities of immigrant life. When Halloween crossed the Atlantic, it did not travel as the polished holiday of costumes and candy that we know today. It came in fragments, carried in the memories of Irish and Scottish immigrants who arrived in North America in the 18th and 19th centuries. They brought with them a patchwork of customs, bonfires, disguises, fortune-telling games, ghost stories, and carved lanterns that had long histories in their homelands. In the New World, these traditions found new soil. They adapted, changed, and eventually fused with American culture in ways that would transform Halloween into the global holiday it would become. The Irish and Scots did not see Halloween as a quaint festival. For them, it was still a liminal night, a mixture of solemnity and mischief. In rural Ireland, children and young men dressed in costumes still went door to door, demanding food or playing tricks if refused. Turnip lanterns carved with grimacing faces glowed at doorways, serving as both ward and warning. Apples, nuts, and cabbage were used in divination games, and ghost stories were told by firelight. In Scotland, guising was widespread, with costumed children performing songs, reciting poems, or telling jokes in exchange for gifts. These practices, though already centuries old, were alive when immigrants set sail for America. The great waves of Irish immigration in the 19th century, especially during and after the potato famine of the 1840s, brought these customs in large numbers. In cities like Boston, New York, and Chicago, Irish communities grew rapidly, and with them, the celebration of Halloween began to take root in American soil. Scottish immigrants, though fewer, also carried guising and divination traditions across the ocean. What had been local, rural rituals in Europe became urban folk customs in immigrant neighborhoods. At first, Halloween in America was not universally embraced. For Protestant settlers with Puritan roots, the festival carried troubling associations. They viewed it as a relic of paganism and Catholic superstition, tied to saints, purgatory, and the dead. Early Puritan communities had little patience for such customs, banning not only Halloween, but even Christmas as frivolous and unholy. For them, the rituals of disguises and offerings were suspiciously close to witchcraft. As a result, Halloween lingered mostly in Irish and Scottish enclaves, kept alive by those who carried it as part of their heritage. Yet, America was a land of adaptation, and Halloween proved resilient. In the crowded neighborhoods of immigrant cities, where poverty, hardship, and prejudice pressed hard, Halloween became a night of release. The mischief that had long been part of the festival, pranks, tricks, and chaotic fun, flourished in these new settings. Young people overturned wagons, removed gates from fences, or set livestock loose. Fires were lit, sometimes in controlled bonfires, sometimes in reckless acts of vandalism. Halloween in 19th century America became notorious for rowdiness, blending old world ritual with new world rebellion. At the same time, the more communal and playful aspects of Halloween also took hold. Apples and nuts remained central to parlor games, especially in rural areas and small towns. Bobbing for apples, nut-burning divinations, and mirror rituals were popular at Halloween parties. Newspapers from the mid-19th century describe such games as staples of autumn gatherings, often tied to courtship and flirtation. What had once been rituals of fate became light-hearted amusements, but the seasonal timing remained unchanged. The carved lanterns also adapted. In Ireland and Scotland, people had long carved grotesque faces into turnips or other root vegetables, placing candles inside to frighten away spirits. In America, however, turnips were less common, and pumpkins, larger, easier to carve and abundant in autumn, quickly took their place. The jack-o'-lantern, a symbol with roots in old world belief, became distinctly American through this transformation. Pumpkins, glowing on porches and fences, would eventually become the single most recognizable emblem of Halloween worldwide. By the late 19th century, Halloween was spreading beyond immigrant neighborhoods. Articles in American newspapers described it as a night of mystery and fun, suitable for children and young people. The Victorian fascination with folklore, the supernatural, and ghost stories gave Halloween an added boost. Families hosted parties with fortune-telling games, candlelit storytelling, and apple-bobbing contests. The holiday began to lose its purely ethnic character and became part of a broader American culture. Still, mischief remained. In many towns, Halloween was less about parlor games and more about chaos. Barn doors were removed and hidden, wagons placed on rooftops, and fences dismantled overnight. Police and city officials complained of property damage and unruly crowds. Halloween was a night of disruption, its roots in ritual chaos now expressed as youthful rebellion. This tension between mischief and festivity would shape the next stage of Halloween's transformation. The immigrant roots of Halloween are essential to its story. Without the Irish and Scots, the holiday might never have crossed the Atlantic at all. Without their disguises, divinations, and lanterns, America would not have had the building blocks from which to construct a new version of the festival. They carried Halloween with them as a memory of the old world, and in the new one, it took on a life of its own. Over time, as Halloween spread and evolved in America, it became less about spirits and saints and more about community and play. The rituals were stripped of their religious weight, but the structure remained recognizable. Disguises became costumes, offerings became treats, bonfires became pumpkins, fortune-telling games became party amusements. Out of immigrant traditions and American reinvention, Halloween took its modern shape. But the story does not end there. The jack-o'-lantern, which began as a carved turnip in the hands of Irish villagers, became central to Halloween in America. Its story, rooted in the legend of Stingy Jack and his bargain with the devil, gave the holiday one of its most enduring symbols. To understand how Halloween grew into the festival we know, we must turn to the tale of Jack, the wandering soul, and the glowing lantern that guided him through the dark. The glowing face of a jack-o'-lantern is now so deeply tied to Halloween that it is hard to imagine the holiday without it. Walk down any street in late October and pumpkins grin from porches, their flickering candles lighting the night. But this symbol, so familiar today, has deep roots in folklore and immigrant memory. Long before pumpkins, there were turnips. Long before cheerful grins, there were grotesque, twisted faces carved to ward off spirits. And behind it all was a story, an Irish legend about a man named Jack, a trickster who cheated the devil himself and paid the price for it. The tale of Stingy Jack was told and retold in countless versions, but the core remained the same. Jack was a man of greed and cunning, known for his trickery and lack of generosity. One night, he invited the devil for a drink. True to his miserly nature, Jack did not want to pay for the ale. Instead, he convinced the devil to transform into a coin to cover the cost. The devil agreed, but once he had turned into a coin, Jack snatched him up and slipped him into his pocket, where he also kept a small silver cross. Trapped by the holy symbol, the devil could not escape. Jack released him only after extracting a promise. The devil would not claim Jack's soul when he died. Years passed, and Jack continued his ways. Eventually, death came for him, as it must for all. But when Jack tried to enter heaven, he was turned away for his sins. He then went to hell, expecting the devil to take him in. The devil, bound by his promise, refused. Jack was condemned to wander the earth, denied both heaven and hell. In some versions of the story, the devil tossed Jack a burning coal from the fires of hell to light his way. Jack placed it inside a hollowed-out turnip and carried it as a lantern. From that day forward, he roamed the night as Jack of the Lantern, or Jack-o'-lantern, a restless spirit doomed to wander forever. This legend explained the origin of the lanterns carved in Ireland and Scotland. People hollowed out turnips, beets or potatoes, carving faces into them and placing candles inside. Some said the lanterns were meant to scare away Jack's spirit. Others believed they would frighten off other wandering souls or demonic forces during Samhain. The flickering light, half hidden in a grotesque face, symbolized both protection and danger, a reminder of the wandering dead who moved through the night. These early jack-o'-lanterns were not decorations, they were wards, talismans against the supernatural. When Irish immigrants brought the tradition to America, they discovered pumpkins, larger, easier to carve, and abundant in the autumn season. Pumpkins quickly replaced turnips as the material of choice, and the jack-o'-lantern took on its now familiar form. The American pumpkin gave the old legend new life, expanding the symbol from a folk practice into a widespread custom. Over time, the grim faces became playful, the lanterns less about warding off spirits and more about celebrating the season. Yet even as they became festive, the jack-o'-lanterns carried the memory of Stingy Jack and the shadow of the wandering dead. The story of Stingy Jack resonated because it reflected the themes already present in Halloween. It was about the boundary between life and death, heaven and hell, salvation and damnation. Jack's fate, endless wandering with only a faint light to guide him, captured the unease of a night when souls were believed to roam. His lantern was both a warning and a symbol of survival, a flicker of light in the surrounding darkness. The tale gave the practice of carving lanterns a narrative, linking the folk ritual to a cautionary story of trickery, greed, and eternal exile. The jack-o'-lantern also carried deeper symbolic weight. Fire had always been central to Samhain, lit on hilltops to purify and protect. The lantern was a miniature bonfire, brought to the threshold of the home. Its face, grotesque, human-like, but distorted, was a mask, echoing the disguises worn to confuse spirits. In this way, the jack-o'-lantern condensed the key symbols of Halloween into a single object: fire, mask, and spirit. To place one at the door was to acknowledge the season's dangers and to mark one's participation in the rituals of the dead. As Halloween spread in America, the jack-o'-lantern became its most visible icon. By the late 19th century, newspapers described children carving pumpkins, placing them in windows, and using them in pranks. Some accounts tell of boys carrying jack-o'-lanterns through dark streets to frighten neighbors, echoing the older role of the lantern as a source of mischief and intimidation. In time, the image softened, becoming a cheerful emblem of autumn, but the mischievous undertone never entirely vanished. The pumpkin lantern's rise also shows how Halloween adapted to its American environment. Without pumpkins, the holiday might have remained a small, ethnic festival tied to Irish and Scottish enclaves. With pumpkins, it gained a powerful, distinct symbol that appealed to a broader audience. The jack-o'-lantern was colourful, seasonal, and dramatic, perfect for parties, parades, and decorations. It helped move Halloween from a folk ritual of immigrants to a national celebration. Even now, when children carve smiling faces into pumpkins, the echo of the old legend remains. The glowing light recalls Jack's coal, the carved face recalls the masks of Samhain, and the act itself recalls the ancient belief that light at the threshold keeps danger away. The jack-o'-lantern, for all its cheerful appearances, is still a symbol of the wandering dead and the fragile barrier between worlds. But Halloween was never only about symbols. It was also about behavior, about what people did when the sun went down. And in America, where mischief and rebellion found fertile ground, Halloween became the night of pranks. Fires, tricks, and mayhem spread across towns and cities, turning the old ritual of chaos into something new. Halloween was no longer only about spirits. It was also about the living testing boundaries, breaking rules, and reveling in the freedom of the dark. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Halloween in America had begun to shed much of its overt religious weight. The prayers for souls and the solemnity of saints' days faded in many communities, but the energy of mischief that had always lurked in the festival did not disappear. Instead, it grew stronger. What had once been ritualized chaos, masks that mocked social order, tricks that stood in for restless spirits, became open pranks and mayhem. Halloween became the one night of the year when young people were expected, even allowed, to break the rules. The roots of this shift lay in the old Celtic and medieval traditions of inversion. Samhain had always been a time when order broke down and chaos was briefly permitted. Medieval Halloween customs carried this forward, with masked figures demanding food or threatening tricks if refused. When these customs crossed into America, they found a society already marked by tensions between order and rebellion, authority and freedom. Halloween became the night when those tensions were released. By the 1880s and 1890s, newspapers across the United States were full of stories about Halloween pranks. Gates were lifted off their hinges and carried away. Wagons were dismantled and reassembled on rooftops. Livestock were let loose to wander town streets. Windows were soaped, outhouses tipped over, and fences torn apart. These acts were not random vandalism in the eyes of the pranksters. They were part of the spirit of the night, the same spirit that had once licensed chaos around the bonfire. Communities tolerated them up to a point because they were seen as traditional. But the damage sometimes went too far, and complaints grew louder each year. In cities, the mischief could take on a more menacing tone. Fires were set, sometimes as bonfires, sometimes as arson. Crowds of boys roamed streets, breaking windows or pulling down street lamps. In places like Detroit, the mischief grew into what became known as Devil's Night or Hell Night, evenings of widespread vandalism and arson that preceded Halloween. The destructive side of the holiday alarmed city officials, police, and parents who feared the night was spiraling out of control. The darker side of Halloween mischief reflected the anxieties of urbanization and immigration. Crowded cities, poverty, and generational conflict gave young people both the motivation and the opportunity to vent frustrations in public displays of rebellion. Halloween, with its ancient license for disorder, provided the perfect cover. What might have been tolerated in rural villages as harmless tricks now became serious problems in cities with fragile infrastructure and dense populations. Communities responded in different ways. Some cracked down with police patrols and curfews, trying to suppress mischief by force. Others sought to redirect the energy of the holiday into more controlled activities. By the early 20th century, civic leaders, churches, and schools began organizing Halloween parties, parades, and community events as alternatives to chaos in the streets. These efforts were not only about fun, they were attempts to domesticate Halloween, to tame its wild spirit by giving young people structured outlets for their energy. This shift marks one of the key transformations in Halloween's history. What had been a night of disorder was gradually reshaped into a night of festivity. Costumes were encouraged not only as disguises against spirits, but as playful dress-up. Instead of knocking on doors to demand food under threat of mischief, children were invited to trick or treat in supervised neighborhoods. Pumpkins were carved not to scare away Jack or wandering souls, but to decorate homes for parties. The wildness of the holiday was softened, turned from menace to merriment. Yet the memory of mischief has never fully disappeared. Even as trick-or-treating became the norm, older children and teenagers continued to use Halloween as a night for pranks. Toilet paper streaming from trees, eggs splattered on windows, and soaped cars are the modern descendants of wagon tipping and gate lifting. The line between play and vandalism has always been thin on Halloween, reflecting its ancient role as the night when rules could be bent. The rise of Hell Night and similar traditions also ensured that Halloween carried an undertone of danger well into the 20th century. Communities could not forget that fires and riots once accompanied the holiday, and even today, rumors of poisoned candy or dangerous pranks tap into that older fear. The tension between fun and menace is part of Halloween's identity, a reminder that beneath the costumes and candy lies a history of rebellion and disruption. Still, the domestication of Halloween was remarkably successful. By the mid-20th century, the holiday had been transformed from a night of vandalism into a family-centered celebration. Community trick-or-treating replaced mischief, and commercial industries, from candy companies to costume makers, helped spread the new vision of Halloween. But this transformation did not erase the past, it was built on it. The playful tricks of children at the doorstep are echoes of the threatening pranks of earlier generations, just as those pranks were echoes of the ritual chaos of Samhain. Halloween had survived once again by adapting. From Celtic fires to medieval disguises, from immigrant pranks to civic parades, it kept shifting, absorbing new forms while holding on to its core. A night when order gave way to the uncanny. And with the rise of parties, candy, and costumes, the holiday was about to change again, this time in a way that would secure its place as one of the most celebrated nights of the year. The Victorian age, with its fascination for folklore, childhood, and the supernatural, would play a crucial role in this transformation. Halloween was no longer just a night for mischief or fear. It was becoming a carefully reinvented holiday, reimagined for families, communities, and a growing culture of festivity. By the middle of the 19th century, Halloween in America and Britain stood at a crossroads. In some places, it was still feared as a night of mischief, chaos, and even danger, tied to fire, vandalism, and roaming crowds of pranksters. In others, especially among immigrant families, it was still a folk festival of disguises, lanterns, and games. But in the broader culture, a transformation was beginning. The Victorian era, with its fascination for folklore, childhood innocence, and domestic festivity, reimagined Halloween. What had once been the devil's night of fear and rebellion was carefully reshaped into an evening of parlor games, storytelling, and family-friendly fun. The Victorian reinvention of Halloween was part of a larger cultural trend. The 19th century was a time when many folk traditions were collected, sanitized, and reintroduced as respectable entertainment. Ghost stories, fairy tales, and seasonal customs that had once been tied to rural survival or pagan belief were now presented as heritage, nostalgia, and amusement. Halloween fit perfectly into this pattern. It offered folklore to rediscover, supernatural tales to tell, and rituals to adapt for the parlor. The holiday's rougher edges could be softened, its darker fears turned into playful thrills. Magazines and newspapers of the time published guides for hosting Halloween gatherings. These were not nights of vandalism or mischief, but organized social events. Young men and women gathered in parlors lit by candles, where apples floated in basins of water and nuts cracked in hearth fires. Fortune-telling games, once tied to real anxieties about love and survival, became party amusements. Guests laughed as apple peels fell into strange shapes, or as mirrors supposedly revealed faint shadows of future spouses. What had once been dangerous divination became flirtatious entertainment, part of the courtship rituals of youth. Ghost stories also flourished in Victorian Halloween settings. The Victorians were deeply fascinated by the supernatural, from seances and spiritualism to Gothic novels and haunted houses. Halloween became the chosen night for sharing eerie tales, told around the fire with just enough candlelight to cast shadows on the walls. These stories could be frightening, but they were also theatrical, designed to thrill without threatening real danger. The haunted harvest of medieval folklore was reborn as a parlor pastime. The visual culture of Halloween also began to change in this period. Greeting cards, postcards, and illustrations depicted children, witches, black cats, and pumpkins in whimsical rather than terrifying ways. Where medieval sermons had described Halloween as the devil's night, Victorian artwork portrayed it as a charming blend of harvest and play. Witches appeared on broomsticks, but they smiled mischievously rather than threatening doom. Black cats arched their backs, but they were drawn with wide, playful eyes. Pumpkins grinned rather than glared. The iconography of Halloween was being tamed, turned into imagery that could circulate in middle-class homes without fear of scandal. This reinvention did not erase mischief entirely. pranks still flourished in rural towns and immigrant neighborhoods. And in some cities, Halloween was still associated with vandalism. But the dominant cultural image of Halloween was shifting. It was no longer only the night of chaos. It was also a night of gathering, games, and imagination. This shift was encouraged by educators, clergy, and civic leaders who saw in the holiday an opportunity to channel youthful energy into safer, more constructive activities. Instead of cracking down harshly on pranks, some communities began to host organized parties or parades, offering fun as an alternative to destruction. The Victorian focus on children was especially important. The 19th century saw the rise of the modern idea of childhood as a stage of innocence to be cherished and protected. Festivals and holidays were increasingly reshaped around children's participation. Halloween, with its costumes, games, and harmless scares, was perfect for this. Instead of being a dangerous night of spirits or rowdy youths, it could be a charming occasion for children to dress up, play, and imagine. The holiday was reframed as a celebration of creativity and fun rather than menace. This reinvention also coincided with the growing popularity of commercial goods tied to holidays. Halloween postcards, party decorations, and costumes were produced and sold widely by the late 19th and early 20th centuries. What had once been folk customs tied to survival were now commodities tied to seasonal celebration. The commercial aspect was still small compared to what it would become, but the seeds were planted. Halloween was no longer only carried in memory or practice, it was printed, advertised, and sold. The Victorian reinvention was not uniform everywhere. In rural Ireland, Scotland, and parts of America, older customs of guising, offerings, and outdoor mischief continued. But in urban centres and among the growing middle class, Halloween was increasingly seen as an indoor celebration, framed by parlour walls and decorated with charming illustrations. The holiday now had two faces, one of lingering mischief in the streets, and another of playful fun in homes. Together, they allowed Halloween to spread across cultural and social boundaries. By the turn of the 20th century, Halloween had been transformed. It was still a night of ghosts and fortune, still tied to apples, masks, and lanterns, but it was also a night of laughter, games, and domestic festivity. The dangerous edge of the holiday had not disappeared, but it had been softened. The Victorians had tamed Halloween, making it a holiday not only of fear but of fun. This shift laid the foundation for the holiday's greatest transformation of all. With the rise of the 20th century, Halloween would become fully commercialized, its images standardized, and its customs reshaped for mass participation. Candy, costumes, and commerce would define the modern version of Halloween, turning an ancient night of ritual into one of the most widely celebrated holidays in the world. By the early 20th century, Halloween had already been softened by Victorian parlour games and domestic reinvention, but it was still a holiday with two competing faces. In some towns and cities, it was remembered mostly for pranks and vandalism, the dreaded Hell Night of broken fences, soaped windows, and overturned wagons. In others, it was an evening of apple-bobbing ghost stories and laughing children in makeshift costumes. What happened next would resolve this tension, not by suppressing one side completely, but by reshaping the holiday into something that could appeal across all classes and communities. Halloween entered the modern age through a process that turned it into a commercial powerhouse. Candy, costumes, and mass-produced decorations transformed it from a patchwork of folk traditions into one of the most visible holidays in America, and eventually the world. The first step in this transformation came with the growing emphasis on children. The late 19th and early 20th centuries had already redefined childhood as a stage of innocence and imagination. Reformers, educators, and civic leaders saw in Halloween a chance to channel youthful energy away from destructive pranks and into controlled fun. Instead of allowing young people to tear up fences or light dangerous fires, communities organized parades, parties, and trick-or-treating events. This shift reframed Halloween as a children's holiday rather than a night of rebellion. Costumes, once rough disguises of animal skins or rags, began to evolve into purpose-made outfits. At first they were homemade, fashioned from sheets, paper, and old clothes. By the 1920s and 1930s, however, companies were manufacturing costumes on a large scale, selling witches, ghosts, clowns, and skeletons in bright packages. Candy followed a similar path. In the early days of American Halloween, children collected apples, nuts, cakes, or coins when they went guising. But by the mid-20th century, candy companies began to position their products as the perfect Halloween treat. Individually wrapped sweets offered convenience, hygiene, and a kind of uniformity that matched the holiday's growing commercial culture. By the 1950s, with suburban neighborhoods booming and trick-or-treating firmly established, candy had become the dominant reward handed out at doors. The marketing power of companies like Hershey's, Mars, and Nestlé ensured that chocolate bars and candy corn replaced apples and cakes as the universal currency of the holiday. The rise of suburbia was crucial to this change. After World War II, American suburbs offered the perfect environment for trick-or-treating. Safe neighborhoods with rows of houses, each with a porch light waiting to be lit. Parents encouraged the practice as a wholesome alternative to mischief, and children embraced it as a night of adventure. Newspapers and magazines promoted trick-or-treating as a community ritual, where neighbors showed generosity and children learned polite participation. The phrase trick-or-treat itself, first recorded in the 1920s and 1930s, spread rapidly, capturing in 3 words the blend of mischief and offering that had always defined Halloween. Costumes expanded beyond ghosts and witches. By the mid-20th century, manufacturers were selling costumes based on popular culture. Movie monsters like Dracula and Frankenstein, comic book heroes, cartoon characters, and even politicians. Halloween became a holiday of roleplay, where children could step into the identity of anyone or anything. Adults, too, began to reclaim the holiday, hosting costume parties that allowed for humor, satire, or flirtation under the cover of disguise. The mask, once worn to confuse spirits, now offered freedom of expression and play. Decorations also grew in scope. The jack-o'-lantern remained central, but companies began producing paper cutouts, plastic skeletons, and store-bought masks. Halloween imagery, witches, black cats, bats, and haunted houses, was standardized and spread across classrooms, offices, and storefronts. By mid-century, Halloween had its own recognizable aesthetic, distinct from the harvest festivals and religious observances with which it had once overlapped. The commercial industry shaped not only how the holiday looked, but how it was experienced. Television and film further cemented the transformation. Halloween specials, horror movies, and cartoons reinforced the idea of the holiday as a cultural event. From It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown in the 1960s to slasher films like Halloween in the 1970s, the night was portrayed both as playful and as terrifying. This duality reflected its history perfectly. It was both a children's holiday of candy and a cultural exploration of fear. Popular media amplified Halloween's imagery, ensuring it was no longer just a folk celebration, but a major feature of modern entertainment. Yet even as Halloween became commercialized, it retained shadows of its older, darker side. Urban legends about poisoned candy and razor blades hidden in apples spread in the 1970s and 1980s, tapping into the older anxiety that Halloween was a dangerous night. Though almost entirely untrue, these stories reflected the lingering sense that the holiday was not entirely safe, that its roots in mischief and menace still haunted it. Parents inspected candy, communities set curfews, and Halloween safety became a topic of national discussion. Ironically, these fears only strengthened the dominance of factory-wrapped candy, further entwining commerce with tradition. By the late 20th century, Halloween was one of the most profitable holidays of the year, second only to Christmas in some markets. Candy sales soared, costume shops thrived, and haunted attractions drew millions. The holiday had become a fusion of child-centered fun and adult-centered entertainment, a night of masks and indulgence for all ages. Its global spread followed, carried by American media and culture into countries where Halloween had never been celebrated before. Pumpkins, costumes, and trick-or-treating appeared in Europe, Asia, and beyond, transforming Halloween into a worldwide event. But this massive transformation did not erase the past. When children go door to door with candy buckets, they echo the geysers of Scotland and the solars of medieval Europe. When adults carve pumpkins, they repeat the act of hollowing out turnips to ward off spirits. When parties feature apple bobbing, they preserve a Roman and Celtic ritual of divination. Halloween's commercial explosion built on ancient foundations, and its success lay in that continuity. It could change shape endlessly while holding onto the bones of the old festival. The 20th century made Halloween modern, but it did not sever its ties to the past. It was still a night of the dead and the uncanny, even if wrapped in cellophane and marketed with cartoons. It was still a night of mischief, even if the tricks were now egged houses and toilet-papered trees, rather than dismantled wagons. It was still a night of fire and masks, even if the flames burned inside plastic pumpkins and the masks were made of nylon. By the dawn of the 21st century, Halloween stood as both ancient and modern, a holiday that had travelled from Celtic fields to American suburbs, from bonfires on hills to candy in buckets. Its story was far from over, because Halloween was no longer only American. It was spreading across the globe, adapting again, reshaping itself for new cultures, and proving once more that a festival born of thresholds could never stop crossing them. Halloween in the 21st century is no longer confined to the Celtic hills, the Irish countryside, or even the American suburbs where it found its modern shape. It has become a global event, recognized and celebrated in countries far from its original roots. The journey from Samhain bonfires to trick-or-treating streets has carried the holiday across centuries and continents, and today it stands as one of the most widely recognized festivals in the world. Yet for all the costumes, candy, and commercial displays, Halloween continues to carry echoes of its ancient past. It is still a night of masks and fire, of fear and play, of shadows and celebration. In the United States, Halloween has become an annual ritual that fills October with a sense of anticipation. Houses are decorated with pumpkins, skeletons, and spiderwebs weeks before the 31st. Haunted attractions open their doors, from small local hayrides to massive commercial haunted houses that draw crowds of thousands. Television programming shifts to horror films and Halloween specials, and stores fill with costumes ranging from playful superheroes to grotesque monsters. On the night itself, millions of children take to the streets with buckets and bags, repeating the ancient practice of visiting neighbors in disguise and receiving offerings in return. For many families, Halloween has become as central a holiday as Thanksgiving or Christmas, woven deeply into the seasonal cycle. But Halloween is no longer only for children. Adults have reclaimed it, transforming it into one of the largest party nights of the year. Costume balls, bar events, and themed gatherings allow adults to play with identity, humor, and fear in ways reminiscent of the old disguises of Samhain. The mask, once a tool to confuse spirits, is now a license for creativity, satire, and even transgression. Halloween offers a socially sanctioned space where norms can be bent, roles inverted, and the strange or forbidden embraced. In this way, the holiday has retained its ancient role as a time of license and inversion, even if the setting is now a nightclub rather than a firelit hill. The commercial industry surrounding Halloween has grown enormous. Candy sales reach into the billions, and costume companies release new designs each year tied to popular films, television shows, and internet trends. Home decoration has expanded from simple pumpkins to elaborate displays rivaling those of Christmas. Entire neighborhoods compete in transforming their houses into haunted spectacles. The economic weight of Halloween reflects its cultural dominance. It has moved beyond folk ritual to become a cornerstone of seasonal commerce. Globally, Halloween's spread has been uneven but remarkable. In Canada, with its strong Irish and Scottish immigrant history, Halloween traditions developed alongside those of the United States and remain nearly identical. In Mexico and Latin America, Halloween intersects with Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead. While distinct in origin, the two festivals share themes of honoring the dead, offering food, and blurring the boundary between living and departed. In some regions, the two celebrations have merged, with children trick-or-treating on Halloween night and families building altars for ancestors in the days that follow. This blending shows how Halloween adapts, never erasing, but intertwining with local customs. In Europe, Halloween has returned to the lands of its ancestors in new form. Ireland and Scotland, where Samhain first took root, have seen Halloween grow into both a folk revival and a modern spectacle. Traditional bonfires still burn in rural areas, while cities host parades, fireworks, and costume parties. In England, where the holiday had once faded, Halloween was revived largely through American influence, with trick-or-treating and pumpkin carving spreading rapidly in the late 20th century. Continental Europe has followed, with Germany, France, and Spain embracing Halloween celebrations in varying degrees, often mixing them with their own harvest festivals or All Saints traditions. In Asia, Halloween has become especially popular in urban centers. Japan, for example, has adopted the holiday with enthusiasm, though often without trick-or-treating. Instead, massive costume parades and themed events dominate, with young adults filling city streets in elaborate outfits. In South Korea, China, and the Philippines, Halloween is celebrated through a mix of Western-style parties, horror attractions, and local ghost traditions. Even in places where it is not officially recognized, the imagery of pumpkins, ghosts, and witches has entered popular culture, spread through films, advertising, and social media. This global expansion has sometimes raised debates. Critics in various countries argue that Halloween is an imported, commercialized holiday that overshadows local traditions. Yet its success lies precisely in its adaptability. Just as Samhain absorbed Roman and Christian elements, just as immigrant Halloween reshaped itself in America, the modern holiday blends into local cultures, rather than replacing them entirely. It is a holiday of thresholds, capable of crossing borders as easily as it once crossed from one season to the next. At the same time, Halloween continues to serve as a mirror of cultural anxieties. The costumes reflect not only timeless figures like witches and ghosts, but also contemporary fears and fascinations. Political figures, movie villains, internet memes. Haunted attractions channel deeper unease about death, violence, and the unknown, packaging them into safe experiences of fear. Urban legends about poisoned candy or dangerous strangers reflect the old belief that Halloween is never entirely safe, that beneath the laughter lies a lingering shadow. The holiday's endurance comes from this balance. It is playful, but never free of unease, festive, but never without a hint of dread. Despite its modern trappings, Halloween remains bound to its oldest themes. It is still about death, disguise, and the fragile line between safety and danger. It is still about offerings, though now in candy wrappers rather than loaves of bread or soul cakes. It is still about light in the darkness, whether in the flames of a bonfire or the glow of a carved pumpkin. It is still about masks, whether made of animal skins, painted paper, or plastic. The forms have changed, but the essence endures. Today, Halloween is both global and local, ancient and modern, playful and serious. It is a holiday of contradictions, which is why it continues to fascinate. For some, it is a chance to dress up and collect candy. For others, it is a night for horror movies, haunted houses, and the thrill of fear. For still others, it is tied to older rituals of honoring the dead, remembering ancestors, and marking the turning of the year. Each layer, each version adds to its richness. The journey of Halloween from sacred ritual to worldwide holiday is not just a story of change. It is a story of continuity through transformation. Every generation has reshaped it to fit its needs. From druids lighting bonfires to suburban children filling candy buckets. From Irish turnip lanterns to Japanese cosplay parades. The holiday survives because it adapts, because it thrives in the spaces between worlds, between past and present, life and death, fear and fun. That liminal quality, born in the dark fields of Samhain, is what has carried Halloween across centuries and continents. And so when the night of October 31st arrives, when masks are worn and pumpkins glow, when laughter and fear mingle in the streets, we are still participating in the same ancient dance. The costumes may be different, the treats sweeter, the settings more global, but the heart of Halloween remains unchanged. A night of thresholds, a night of shadows, a night when the worlds meet and the living pause to celebrate the uncanny.